Chapter 7, Possibility Modals. Until now, we've been looking at sentences like John wins. For that kind of a sentence, the truth or falsity depends only on whether John wins in the actual world. But now we're going to start looking at sentences that are examining possibilities and necessities. Sentences like John may win. The truth or falsity of this sentence does not depend on whether John wins in the actual world. To say, for example, that John may win tomorrow's match, it doesn't matter whether he does win or he doesn't. It just matters that there's a possibility of his winning. So we're going to be looking at these so-called modal sentences that depend on possibilities rather than actual facts. English has a large number of modals. It has modals that describe possibility. Those would be things like may, might, can, and could, which are the four modals we'll be looking at here. But it also includes adverbial expressions like possibly, maybe, perhaps, and some adjectival things like possible or potential. For necessity modals, we have a larger number of auxiliary elements like shall, should, must, ought to, need, have to, will, and would. Also, we have necessarily, certainly as adverbs, and necessary and certain as adjectives. We're going to give a general analysis of modal statements that depends on possible worlds. In particular, our basic idea for a possibility modal, like John may win, is going to be that there's at least one relevant possible world in which John wins. If there is a world, that means it's something that could happen. Okay. John must win is going to say that in every relevant possible world, John wins. And the challenge will be to specify what does it mean for a world to be relevant as a possible world. So looking at this just at the very, very broad outline, we have a sentence, John may win. And we're going to translate that into predicate logic as an existential formula. It's got an existential quantifier with a world variable, W. There is some world W, and then we have our formula, win John W. We'll get to the analysis of that in a minute, but I want to just draw your attention to one fact. The fact that the predicate win is now being taken in the logic to have two arguments rather than just one. In addition to taking the individual, John, who is the one who is supposed to do the winning, we also have a world variable, W. And this will affect how we analyze simple sentences like John wins, something that we won't do in this chapter. We'll do it next chapter. Okay, so let's go ahead and accept that we have this as a translation for now. It's a little bit simplified. We will be adding to it, but we can see how it works in outline. We take that and we put it between our interpretation brackets here and here to give a denotation, and the denotation will be true in certain circumstances. And the circumstances are calculated exactly the way we calculated the truth conditions for quantified sentences in the last chapter. There, we were quantifying over individuals. We had things like there is an X, such as student X and win X or something, right? Now we have a world W instead of an individual X, but the process of giving an interpretation is exactly the same. It's going to be true if and only if for some world W prime, the nuclear scope, when W John is true with respect to the instructions to assign to W the interpretation W prime. Okay. And we can go ahead and then spell that out in more detail. When is a two-place predicate. That means it takes pairs of things as its arguments. So we have to make sure that a certain pair is in the interpretation of when. And the pair, well, this is just the variable W interpreted with respect to the instruction to assign to W the world W prime. That gives us W prime down here. This is a word named John, which doesn't contain any W. It has instructions, but the instructions have no effect. And so we end up interpreting that as John the individual. And then when is going to be a pair, a set of ordered pairs, a set of all those ordered pairs consisting of W, world W, and individual X, such that X wins in W. So we get this to be true if and only if for some world W prime, John wins in W prime. We're going to do something very similar with must. I'm not going to step through this one in detail, but the details are up here on the screen if you want to look at them afterwards. We interpret John must win with a universal quantifier. It says in every world, when W John comes out true. And in the end, that'll be having the following truth conditions. It'll be true if and only if for every world W prime, John wins in W prime. Right, so this is what I mentioned earlier. When is now a two-place predicate. So we can no longer say things like win John. That's no longer a well-formed expression because we have a two-place predicate with only one argument. Instead, we need things of the form win W John. Okay, so that's the outline of what we want to do, but there are many different modals, and even in the same category of modal auxiliary, we have 4 possibility modals. 4 modals that all tell us that there is some world where such and such can happen. These are may, might, can, and could. And yet they can be used to express different things. That is one way we describe that as saying that they can have different modal flavors. And I'll describe those now. So we'll start with the sentence, John may win. And we ask, what kinds of things can it be used to say? And I'm grouping these a little bit together because ultimately we're going to put these together into a small number of groups. The first group is group that involves some kind of permission. It could be the speaker giving permission to John to win. Usually speaker permission is like you may win or you may do something, but it's possible to do it using the name John as well to directly give John permission. A little bit better for this sentence is to say something like John has a permission given by someone else to win. And we'll give a situation where that will come out as a natural thing to say in a minute. It could also be that the law allows John to win. Okay. Now, this particular sentence doesn't really highlight the law interpretation. It doesn't highlight the speaker permission interpretation. We can use different sentences for that. So, for example, John may turn right at this intersection. That would be something that the law allows him to do, and that would be may being used to express what the law permits. Okay. I'm using just one sentence to keep the formalism and formal analysis a lot easier in the end. And you can actually, set up a law that makes it possible for John to win. It's not an impossible thing. It's just not a very natural thing to do. Okay, so that's one class of cases, but we can also use it in a completely different way to say that, for example, for all that I know, it's possible that John will win. Something's happening tomorrow. John may win. John may lose. I don't know. Okay. There's no permission involved here. It's just completely talking about what I know is going to happen, or what I, in this case, don't know for sure is going to happen. It could also be a regular winning. So just like the sentence "John wins" can be used to describe one event, it can also be used to describe kind of a regular occurrence. Like these days, John wins. And John may win can be used in the same way to say, it's possible that John regularly wins. I don't know. Okay, so here are a couple of situations that help to bring out two of these readings. Situation 2, John is much better than his son and can win every game they play. John's wife, however, doesn't allow him to do so. Some days she tells him to lose. If you have children someday, you will understand this very well. Today, however, she said it's okay for John to win. So today, John may win. That is, John has his wife's permission to win. We can understand that sentence in exactly that way. Okay, 4. This was the knowledge case. Suppose that John is playing a chess tournament in a chess tournament tomorrow. His opponent is as good as he is at chess. And so it's very hard to predict the outcome. John may win, but he may not win. Okay, John may win means that given the facts as I know them, his winning is a possibility. Okay, so that was may. When we look at can, we find a slightly different range of interpretations that it can have. I can say John can win and still be using it to give permission. Today, John's wife gave him permission, so John can win today. But yesterday, he wasn't allowed to. And tomorrow, he probably can't again. Okay. It doesn't have a reading where it's talking about what the speaker thinks. So if I say John can win tomorrow, it's a very hard to get that to mean, as far as I know, it might happen. It's easy to get it to mean permission. It can also mean, I'll skip to 7, that John has the ability to win tomorrow. Okay, and from that we can infer perhaps that it's a possibility, but it's really just telling us about an ability. There's another reading, though, that comes out with can, which is a goal, something in order to achieve a particular goal. Suppose that John has the goal of becoming famous. He is enrolled in a chess tournament. And in a chess tournament, there's really only one way to become famous. But there are other possibilities in life as well outside of the tournament. Okay, well, there are many ways you can become famous in a tournament as well, I guess. Okay, so one way for John to become famous is John can win. Okay, that is, winning is one thing John can do in order to become famous. The modal can is telling us something about a way of reaching a goal. It doesn't work with may. If you try the same thing, in order to become famous, John may win. It's interpretable, but it doesn't mean that winning is one way of achieving the goal. If you want to interpret it, you can interpret it as John has permission to win, and maybe that's going to be able to make him famous. I don't know. Okay. So some modals have certain interpretations and lack other interpretations. So this was my becoming famous in a chess tournament example. The ability interpretation, we can modify our situation of John and his wife. Let's say John's wife has strictly prohibited him from beating his son at chess. She told him that he is not allowed to win ever, because she wants her son to get interested, and he'll be more interested if he wins, and so blah, 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 blah. John is playing his son, and I tell you, John can win. That is, he's much better at chess than his son. He's just never allowed to win. Here is a John can win, which is basically saying John has the ability, the capability of winning. This is what we could call an ability interpretation of can. Okay, now let's turn to might. If I say John might win, that does not really work as a way of giving John permission to win. Not as a law, not as something that the speaker gives permission to him for, not as a comment on what John's wife allows. Might really is not good for giving permission. It is very good at telling what the speaker, what's possible according to the speaker. So where John has a game coming up tomorrow, and I think winning is a possibility, I can say, well, John might win tomorrow. Okay. It's also possible to use it as a way of achieving a goal. In order to become famous, John might win the tournament, or maybe a little bit better. In order to become famous, John might try winning the tournament. The try seems to help out a little bit to make it more natural, but the basic idea is still the same, that winning is one way of becoming famous. Might, however, does not have a possibility interpretation. To say that John might win is not to say that John has the capability of winning. It's kind of hard to tease that apart sometimes from knowledge. If I say John might win, and I mean that according to everything that I know, there's a possibility of his winning. Well, if I know about his ability, then that would imply that he has the ability necessary to win. But if you set up a situation so that I don't know anything about his ability, all I know is that there's going to be a game tomorrow between John and Bill, and I know nothing else about either of them. Well, you know, when there's a game, there's usually a winner. It's usually one of the two people playing, and so John might win. That works perfectly fine for telling you about John, my knowledge of the situation. But it could actually be that John is playing a game that he knows nothing about, that he doesn't even know the rules to, and one of the rules is if you make a mistake, you lose. So there's really no possibility of John winning. In terms of his ability, he doesn't have the ability to win. So in that sense, John doesn't have the ability to win, but since I don't know that, I think he might win. Okay, The might can't be used to say he has the ability. In this situation, we couldn't say John might win. That is, no, I wouldn't say it's not possible. It's not the case that John might win. That doesn't work, and you would expect it to work if might had an ability kind of an interpretation. The last one we'll look at is could. Could has probably the broadest range of interpretations. It can be used in all of the situations that we've described. So John could win could be talking about his permission. John could turn right at the traffic light. The law allowed him to. That's permission. What's going to happen tomorrow? I don't know. John could win with respect to my knowledge. It could be in order to become famous, John could win. Okay, in order to achieve a certain goal, this is one way of one possibility he could try. Or John could win. He has the ability. Could be just a simple ability. And could can also shift things into the past. So we have in the past, maybe John had permission to win. He was playing against his son last week and he could win. His mother, his wife allowed it. But in the end, he didn't. Or it could be about the law allowing things in the past. Could be a way of reaching a goal in the past. It could be an ability he had in the past. Back in his youth, John could win at a tournament. Today, he no longer can. He doesn't have that ability anymore. There's also another usage of could that's talking about possibilities we know aren't real. If John had been 2 feet taller, he could win the high jump. I don't know. The could is not something, a real possibility. It's a kind of a counterfactual, hypothetical possibility instead. We're not going to look too much at that in this chapter. So I said before, cases 1 through 3 all involve permission. And we're going to give those a name now. We're going to call those deontic modal expressions. It's talking about what's possible or necessary relative to someone's permissions or requirements. So it could be speaker permission, another individual's permission, government permission in term as put into a law. Cases 4 and 5 involve compatibility with knowledge. It could be knowledge about what's about the future, knowledge about something at the time of speech, and we call these epistemic modals. Case 6, I said, involves reaching a goal, and the goal-oriented modals we call teleological modals. Finally, case 7 was the ability, something that John can do. We'll call that an ability modal. Cases 8 through 11, those are the past tense versions of deontic, teleological, and ability modals. So we can summarize the possibilities like this. May has a deontic and an epistemic interpretation, but it doesn't have either teleological or ability interpretations. Might doesn't have a deontic interpretation. It doesn't have an ability interpretation, but it does have epistemic and teleological interpretations. Can has all interpretations except probably an epistemic interpretation. And could can be interpreted in any of the four ways. Okay, so we've got this patterns, these different patterns of how things can be interpreted, and we want an explanation for where these differences come from. And our explanation is going to be basically this, that they all involve quantification over worlds, but they don't look at all of the worlds. Each of them looks at a smaller set of worlds and maybe different sets. If you quantify over this set, you get deontic interpretation. Quantify over this set, and you get epistemic interpretation. Okay? So the different flavors involve quantification over different sets of worlds. Okay, so deontic modals first. They quantify over worlds in which everything that happens follows some set of rules or requirements. Okay, so imagine that there are two requirements. Requirement one is that John win. Requirement two is that John not laugh. Then with respect to these requirements, the following statements come out true and false. John may win. That's true. It's allowed by the requirements. John may laugh. That's false. That's not allowed by the requirements. He's required not to laugh. That doesn't allow him to laugh. Okay? And we can diagram it this way. Suppose we have in the large box every possible world that exists. We're going to split those into separate subgroups. Here we have, sorry, I can't do it the way I want to. We want here and here in these worlds, those are worlds in which John wins. This one and this one over here, those are worlds in which John does not win. Up above, we have worlds in which John laughs. Down below, we have worlds in which John does not laugh. Okay? And the circle and the X are meant to indicate which worlds are worlds in which all of the rules, all of the requirements are followed. Here, they're all followed. Those are worlds where John wins and John does not laugh. It's required that John wins. It's required that John does not laugh, and those requirements are met. Here, in contrast, John wins and John laughs. That satisfies the John winning requirements, but it fails to satisfy the requirement that John not laugh, and so those worlds are not worlds where all of the requirements are met. Similarly here, this doesn't satisfy any of the requirements, and this satisfies one of the requirements, the John does not laugh requirement, but not the other, the John win requirement. So we're going to call the rules in which all rules, the worlds in which all rules are followed, perfect rule following worlds. I'll abbreviate that as PRWs. So John may win is true deontically if and only if there's some perfect rule following world, PRW, in which John wins. Okay? And we'll connect that to the intuition as follows. If there's a perfect rule following world in which John wins, it follows that John's winning does not break any rules. It follows the rules. And so it's permitted by the rules. So all deontic modals involve rules or requirements of some sort, but they can differ in what rules count. It could be the speaker's rules or requirements. It could be some John's wife's requirements. It could be the laws. So the perfect rule following world is not an absolute thing. What worlds count depends on what rules you look at. So we're going to say that the PRWs depend on some set of rules R. And we'll formalize that like this. We're going to say here, PRW is true of a world W and a rule. And we interpret this to say that W is a perfect rule following world with respect to the rules R that satisfy this. Okay. And what is this? Well, this is what we use to interpret definite descriptions in the last chapter. It's iota R, which is going to refer to R, whatever R is going to be, in this case, if there's exactly one thing that satisfies this. It's got to be a set of rules, and it's got to have some property C. C is going to be taken from the context. It could be the speaker's requirements. If you're telling somebody what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, and you are, for example, that person's parent, you have the authority to tell them what they're allowed to do, okay, then your child will probably understand that you are telling what your requirements are, okay, speaker requirements. If you're talking about what's possible in driving circumstances, it's more likely the law. So C could be the requirements of a law, okay? So now let's get to the interpretation of the sentence, John may win. We said that may has a deontic interpretation, and so we're going to say that involves a particular form of may. We'll take may to be ambiguous between a deontic interpretation and an epistemic interpretation. This is the deontic one. It says that there is some world, W, where W is a perfect rule following world with respect to the rules R that are, and in this case, I've gone ahead and put SR. In the textbook, I explained this is used to mean speaker requirements, okay? We could have used the laws, we could have used school rules, we could have used John's wife's requirements. I've just chosen speaker requirements here, okay? So there's some world which is a world in which all of the speaker's requirements are followed, in which John wins. That's our interpretation of deontic John may win. I'll go through the interpretation in a little bit more detail here for the deontic one. For the others, I'll leave it to you to go through in detail in the chapter in the book. So here we have an existential quantifier over worlds W. What that does is introduces a, for some worlds, W prime, and it tells us to interpret with respect to rules that tells to assign to W the world W prime here and here. And it requires that the two things that are being conjoined, this is one of them, and this is another one, those two things both have to come out as true. Okay. And then we just go through all of the formal calculation that is appropriate for existential interpretation in general. PRW here is a two-place predicate. It has two arguments. We need each of the pairing of those two arguments then to be part of the denotation of PRW itself. Win is a two-place predicate. We need it to we need its two arguments to pair up to be a member of the denotation of win. And so we're going to end up with something that's true if and only if for some world W prime, the pairing of W prime with the unique speaker requirement rules R is one of the pairings that follows, which gives you a perfect rule following world. And that pairing of W prime with John gives you something that is in the denotation of win. Putting it in more general English terms, it gives you the following. The sentence is true if and only if, for some world W prime is a perfect rule following world with respect to the speaker's requirements, and John wins at W prime. This analysis contains a fixed part and a variable part. We can illustrate that rather than saying John may win, let's take John win to be abbreviated by Q. And so we'll say that this is the sentence may Q. The fixed part then is this. For a deontic modal, we're always talking about perfect rule following worlds. We're always talking about a particular set of rules. So this part is always going to be fixed. But it doesn't tell us itself what rules those are. That's the variable part. That's something that can be speaker requirements. It can be John's wife's requirements, law requirements, etc. Okay, epistemic modals, we said, quantify over the set of worlds compatible with someone's knowledge. So John may win is true epistemically if and only if, in some worlds compatible with the speaker's knowledge, John wins. And a world W is compatible with the speaker's knowledge if and only if everything that the speaker knows is true at W. Okay. So we're going to do that very similarly to the way we did rule following. In rule following, we had perfect rule following world. Here we have knowledge world. In rule following, we had rules here, the rules that counted. Here we have a person whose knowledge counts. And again, we have a contextual variable C here, a property that has to be given by the context. It could be the speaker. That's the norm for epistemic interpretation. But we could also make it somebody else. I could say, according to Mary, John may win. I, on the other hand, know that he won't. Okay, my knowledge could be different from Mary's. Mary's knowledge allows the possibility of John winning. Mine may not. And so if we take C to be the speaker, SP, we put speaker into here, we end up with John may win, giving us this as a logical translation. There's some world compatible with the knowledge of the unique individual who is a speaker and a person. And in that world, John wins. Okay, like I said, I'm not going to go through the details of the interpretation here, but I'll give you the consequence at the end. The sentence is true if and only if for some world W prime is compatible with the knowledge of the speaker, and John wins at W prime. Now, it's important to note, being compatible with the speaker's knowledge is not the same as being known by the speaker. So let me give you an example of what speaker's knowledge could be that would be compatible with John winning. It would be a situation, for example, where John knows exactly one thing, that it's raining. Raining has nothing to do with winning, completely irrelevant to winning. But suppose that that's the only thing that John knows. Okay, well, every world in which it's raining is compatible with the speaker's knowledge. And in some of those worlds, John wins. In some of the worlds, he loses, okay. But since he wins in some of those worlds, his winning is compatible with the speaker's knowledge. And so John may win is predicted to be true on the analysis that we've given when interpreted as an epistemic modal with respect to this kind of a speaker. And it makes sense, you know, if you say the only thing I know is that it's raining, and so given what I know, John may win, he may lose. It's basically saying I know nothing about whether John is going to win or lose, and so anything is possible. Okay, let's look next at teleological modals. A teleological modal quantifies over worlds in which a certain goal is reached. And we're going to have to add something here that we didn't have to add to the other ones. But first, let me give a kind of a broad outline of what we want to do, and then we'll see how we can make it work. Our broad outline is a tentative analysis. It says to reach a goal G, you can do P. Or to reach G, can P, this is an abbreviation. Okay. It says in some world in which G is reached, P is true. Now, if that's all we say, it's not going to be good enough. We'll look at an example. Suppose I have the following sentence. To get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours, you can take the Shinkansen. That happens to be a true sentence. The Shinkansen can go in as little as 2 hours and 20 minutes. So that's enough to make it in 3 hours. Okay. To get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours, you can walk. That's generally taken to not be true. Tokyo is 450 kilometers or so away from Kyoto, and nobody can walk 450 kilometers in 3 hours. Okay. But what does this, as an analysis, predict for the two cases? Well, it predicts truth in this one because there is some world in which You go from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours, and in which you take the Shinkansen. Okay. But it also predicts that this one should be true. And here's why. There are worlds that are very different from the actual world, but are considered possible worlds. So in one of those possible worlds, Tokyo and Kyoto are kind of right next to each other, 10 kilometers away. Okay. 10 kilometers you can walk in 3 hours. So that's a world in which somebody can go from Tokyo to Kyoto by walking in 3 hours. That is, in some world in which G is reached, you get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours, P is true, you walk. Okay, that, we don't want that world. Here's another one, world 13. Tokyo and Kyoto are 450 kilometers apart, as in the actual world, but you can walk at 200 kilometers an hour. There's a world like that. That's not a logical impossibility. There's nothing contradictory about such a world. But we're really not interested in that kind of a world. If we allow that kind of a world as one of the worlds we look at, we end up with it coming out as true that you can get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours by walking. So somehow we have to get rid of these two worlds. And we're going to do it by adding further restrictions on the worlds quantified over. We're going to say that they have to be like the actual world in all ways related to the goal, with one exception on the next slide. Okay. So for example, when we say you can take the Shinkansen, and we use that as a teleological modal, then in all of the worlds quantified over, the distance between the cities you're going from and to has to be the same as it is in the actual world. The options for traveling have to be the same as they are in the actual world. The speed of transportation has to be the same. The routes covered have to be the same. The laws of physics that the train can't help but follow have to be the same. Okay? The only exception is that the worlds don't have to be the same with respect to whether you take the Shinkansen or not. And that's for a particular reason. Suppose in the actual world you do not take the Shinkansen. Let's say you never take it, ever, okay? If we had to keep that fact constant in all of the worlds that we're looking at, then in every world you quantify over, you do not take the Shinkansen. Or put differently, there is no world among the worlds you're quantifying over in which you do take the Shinkansen. And that would lead to a prediction. It says, in none of the worlds do you get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours by taking the Shinkansen, and therefore the first sentence that says to get from Tokyo to Kyoto in 3 hours, you can take the Shinkansen should be false. That's wrong prediction. We block that prediction by not requiring you take the Shinkansen to have the same value as it does in the actual world for all the worlds that we look at. We will simplify this again, and we're going to give a name to the way we're simplifying things. The sentence, you can take the Shinkansen, we're going to say combines the modal can with you take the Shinkansen. And we're going to call you take the Shinkansen the prejacent of the modal sentence. And we can simplify that as saying this is of the form, I'm sure this should be can and not may, can Q, okay? So the worlds quantified over by teleological modals are worlds where the circumstances are the same as they are in the actual world. And it looks kind of, oh, like a lot to go through. It's a lot to go through. But once you see what it says, you see that it's really telling you exactly what it is that we want it to tell you. This is the set of worlds in which the following holds. Every P, where P is a circumstance in the actual world relevant for achieving a goal G, where P is not Q, Q is, in our case, John takes the Shinkansen. P is not Q either. It's not, John does not take the Shinkansen. All of those circumstances share a truth value at this world and the actual world. Okay, so the set of worlds where all of the circumstances are the same as they are in the actual world, that's what we're quantifying over in teleological modals. At least that's the added restriction that we have for our teleological modals. Okay. We can read it out like this. This is the set of worlds W such that for every circumstance P related to goal G in the actual world W sub A, other than the circumstances Q or not Q, the truth value of P at W is equal to the truth value of P at the actual world. Okay. Now that's a really lot of stuff to have to write and to follow. It makes things look kind of annoyingly detailed. They are detailed. This is part of semantics. You have to deal with it. But very often we abbreviate things, and we can abbreviate this as saying, we can call that the set circ GQW. So I'm going to change to a different example. To be famous, John can win. We have a goal. The goal is being famous. And we're going to make that now a property of worlds. It's a function that can apply to worlds in particular. And the prejacent, John win, that's our Q. We're going to call that lambda W, win W of John. And that makes it possible to take this, which is the official logical translation of John can win, and write it in a slightly nicer, easier to see way. Okay. We can do that because, once we already understand what all of this does and how it works, well, then we just make sure we do the same thing here. Okay. So this says that there's some world which has the same circumstances as the actual world, except perhaps with respect to winning. In which John is famous and in which John wins. Now, there's still something else missing in here, and that is usually when you say in order to achieve a goal, you can do something. Doing the something is expected to come before achieving the goal. Okay? And so being famous is something that should occur later than the winning. And we didn't put that in here because we haven't been looking at time or tense at all. And we're not going to give the full derivation here either, but we can say what this is, when it's going to be true. It'll be true if and only if, for some world W prime, the circumstances regarding John's being famous are the same in W prime and the actual world, except possibly for the circumstances of John winning and John not winning. And John is famous at that world W prime, and John wins at that world W prime. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is look at ability modals. An ability modal quantifies over worlds in which some abilities are the same as they are in the actual world. Okay. If you think of ability as a circumstance, what abilities John has, that's one of the circumstances of the actual world. We can think of an ability modal as like a teleological modal. It requires certain circumstances to hold in all of the worlds quantified over. The difference is that an ability modal doesn't really come with a particular goal. When you say, in order to become famous, John can win, becoming famous is a goal. Okay? If you simply say, John can win, he has the potential. Yeah, there might be goals of John's independently, but that sentence doesn't tell you anything about goals. It just tells you about ability. But we're going to do something that will maybe strike you as odd. We're going to analyze the ability modal as a teleological modal. But it's going to be a very particular analysis where the prejacent, what you're claiming is possible, John winning, is analyzed as the goal. Okay? It gives us the following. John can win as an ability modal means roughly, in order for John to win, or one way to achieve John's winning is for John to win. In order for John to win, John can win. Okay? It looks like it's not really doing anything, but it actually is doing something, because the can, as a teleological modal, tells us that we have to keep the circumstances the way they are. Okay? In particular, the circumstances relevant for John winning. John's abilities happen to be relevant to whether he can win. If John has the ability to win, then he can win. And if he doesn't have the ability to win, he can't. That is a very relevant ability. Since it's relevant to his winning, his ability has to be kept constant in all of the worlds that we look at. okay? If John wins in one of those worlds, that means John has the ability in the actual world needed in order to win. We held that ability constant. We looked in a different world. In one of them, he won. That means he has the ability needed to win. So in this way, we make use of the formal analysis of a teleological modal to give an interpretation that does not feel at all teleological. We've formally given a goal, but the sentence doesn't actually involve trying to reach a goal. Since the goal is what's claimed to be possible anyway, what we end up with instead is that the circumstances needed to reach that have to be held constant. The circumstances involve abilities because they're relevant, and therefore we end up saying that John ends up having one of those, the ability that he needs in order to win. We end up with intuitively something that is not goal-oriented, but rather ability-oriented. Okay, that's it for this week.